We're back again. Thank you very much. And as we enjoy our breakfasts, we are moving on to the next item, which we'll be looking at. And Lawrence Mashungu will be presenting from the Climate Change Management Department. He will be presenting virtually. So at this stage, our technicians will put us through.
I am from the Ministry for Environment, Climate, Tourism, and Hospitality Industry. I'm in the Climate Change Management Department, and I'm specifically responsible for the Low Emission Development Strategy and the nationally determined contribution. So today I will just speak specifically in terms of our targets, especially around the reducing emissions. But most of the issues have already been talked about by the previous speakers. So I'll speak more in terms of what our low emission development strategy talks about in relation to the issues around renewable energy. And I think what possibly I'll be able to do is to ensure that I will speak much concerning maybe the topic at hand. Maybe to the first slide, you can go to the first slide. To the next slide, yes. You can go to the next slide. Okay, thank you. So what I'll talk about today is about the low emission development strategy. So what I will do possibly is to maybe to go through my presentation, then possibly the participants will share, I think, my presentation later on. I think, is this the best way to go? Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, I think as we know, the country has a target under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And the target that we have currently, it is very important to understand that it is energy specific. But I think as most of us, especially in the energy sector, I don't want to go much into the definitions because it is the energy sector which has been actively involved in our nationally determined contribution before we started talking about the issue of updating our NDC. Our NDC is specifically looking at reducing energy-related emissions in the country. And it's not even surprising, obviously, in the country to see a lot of actions in terms of sustainability in the energy space. Because within a very, very short period of time, we've seen 2, 3, 4, 5 policies, including some instruments coming specifically from the Ministry of Energy and the parastatals around it and agencies. We've seen the renewable energy policy, we've seen the biofuels policy, we've also seen the regulation in terms of banning the incandescent bulbs. We are also seeing a lot of issues around energy master plan and also now we are seeing sort of energy efficiency policy. So specifically within that process, we've seen a lot of progress, basically because as a country we have chosen to reduce our energy-related emissions. Obviously, on the basis that we have some challenges in terms of energy, but also realizing the fact that we have the resources in the country which we can channel, and possibly to support the low emission development strategy. We've also seen a lot of policies, but also some financial instruments also coming from the ministry as such, which to us as a Ministry of Environment, we are seeing a lot of, I think, a very profitable collaboration at the government level in terms of approaching the low emission development strategy. So what I will possibly talk today is the fact that, yes, we have done a lot of issues, especially in the energy field, but I think one thing that is very critical also for us is that the country is moving towards broadening its nationally determined contribution to ensure that we now go to other sectors like industry, waste, and forestry, and also agriculture in terms of reducing emissions. But I think one thing that is very critical and important for us is that since we are adding other sectors, especially the forest sector, it is a very, very strong relationship with what we are talking about today, because we are talking of renewable energy. And knowing very well that most of our energy in terms of use in the country obviously comes from biomass resources, where we have a lot of our people using wood for cooking. And more importantly, also now in Harare, there's a lot of people also using wood today, even though some of the activities might be legal and also some of those illegal as such. But we are seeing a lot of people using wood in this process. So in terms of the forestry resources, there is need now for us to ensure that how then do we ensure sustainability in terms of exploration of these resources. And we are very much encouraged, obviously, as government, because we now have the renewable energy policy, which is very important, talking about these huge resources that we have, and now moving towards the issue of efficiency is something that is also very critical for us as a country. So as a background, I just wanted to possibly maybe talk about that before I go specifically maybe to the actions that we have chosen as the country in terms of our low emission development strategy. So you can go to slide number 1, 2, 3, 4. You can go to slide number 5, where there is that diagram. That's where we want to talk about now. Yes, thank you so much. This diagram gives us the emission profile for the country. It is very important for us to understand that the key sectors in terms of emissions in the country is the one energy sector and the agriculture sector, as you can see from that graph. And obviously we have the very small emissions obviously coming from IPPU, which is industrial processes and product use, and also from waste. So it is very critical to understand that these two sectors that have high emissions, they also have high mitigation potential, to such an extent that you would see that there is a lot now of options that the country has chosen in terms of reducing emissions from these two sectors. I was talking to the secretary, talking about the issue of local manufacture of solar products, which is something that is very, very, very important to us. And what we've also done to complement, obviously the efforts done by the Ministry of Energy, in terms of development of our low emission development strategy, we did not just leave it at obviously quantifying the mitigation potential and selecting the targets and leaving it there. But we also went even further to ensure that what is reflected in the policy is also sort of echoed in our low emission development strategy. So if you go to the next slide, you will see our mitigation potential. But then obviously it will give you the mitigation actions and their potential within the energy sector. But then if you then go to the next slide, it gives you the mark curves. These are what we call the marginal abatement curves. So this marginal abatement curve, for those other peaks that you see which are below the graph, and those which are above, especially on the extreme, you will see the difference. So those which are on the extreme left, which the bars which are below the zero line, these are the projects which, when we implement them, they are profitable. We are not implementing them at a cost overrun. Yes, they are initial cost, but at the end of the day, these are profitable. So as a ministry, as the government, we've also carried out some of the actions, especially the ones which are on the extreme left, especially on energy efficiency. They are more on the profitable side of things. So mitigation in terms of approach, it's not only a cost for the majority or for the greater part of the actions that we have chosen in our low emission development strategy. So there are also financial benefits to that. So we've also thought of making sure that when we're doing our low emission development strategy, we also come up with the marginal abatement case to see where are the low-hanging fruits, and for those that are definitely sort of which need a lot of cost, that's where we can now talk of blended finances, and we can now talk of even leveraging even funds from the Green Climate Fund or any other such funds which are there globally. And that's when we can now talk of even coming up with a conditional sort of NDC, which definitely will require obviously some finance flow, especially to deal with some of those mitigation actions possibly which might be at a cost. But you'll find out that the majority of our costs of our mitigation actions, they are more on the negative side, which means that they are more profitable for us to implement in addition to also reducing emissions. So this is some of the actions which are especially on that mark curve, especially on the energy side of things. So one thing that is possible, which is also very critical also with these stakeholders that we have today, is that the country is currently in the process of updating our nationally determined contribution to expand it beyond what it is today. One, in terms of the scope in terms of expanding sectors, but also in terms of expanding the gases that we want to put in. We want also to put in some short-lived climate pollutants within this process. So, but I will dwell much, especially on the end part, and obviously on the update process, because the one thing that is very critical for us is that which are the actions which are in the low emission development strategy that we as a nation would want to take ourselves and say to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in the world over that we want to be tight on these programs as our targets. So very, very important. So if you are to pick an action which has a lower abatement cost, which is more on the profitable side, is something that we can easily, obviously, achieve. But if you also pick something that is on the high cost, is something that we can also leverage on getting even climate finance and also have the opportunity to participate in that process. So these are some of the decisions definitely that we definitely need to make together as stakeholders, that as we are committing ourselves as a ourselves as stakeholders and as government, we need to select the actions that we are ready to. We are definitely at the issue of exploration of our lithium resources. Remember, one thing that is very, very, very critical is that countries like Europe definitely around 2040 they are moving towards phasing out of petrol and diesel cars. But where are they running to get the raw materials? Obviously, it's us in Zimbabwe and many other countries that have also these lithium resources. So why can't we be the hub today of making sure that we sell the finished product, not that we become sort of the safe haven, obviously, where people are coming to pick our raw materials, they ship them outside, then they bring the finished products to sell to us. So why can't we also have a good policy like what we will like in another minerals to make sure that the lithium resource is a special sort of space within our policy and our legislation to ensure that we promote, and not only promote, but to make sure that we get resources out of this process, since the world over, people are running towards these resources. So basically, that's what I want to see, a lot of value chain approach in terms of the way we see our renewable energy resources in the country. So if you look at the other slides which are coming below, they are talking of energy potential and also markets. Also, we are also looking at the other sector just below that. You see the market. Then you can continue to go. Then yeah, that's the market for agriculture. Below that, you see the IPPU, the potential in the IPPU, and also below that one, you see the marginal development curve for the sector. Then below that, you also see the other one, which is West sector, and also that one also see the marginal abatement curve. Plus, please note that these marginal abatement curves, they are a snapshot of 2030, so that you can just see the general direction in terms of the profitability of the mitigation actions that we choose. So what we have done is to ensure that we should have a business approach to our low emission development strategy, so that we also nurture the spirit of responsibility, but also of making sure that we're living in a space where everything is talked in terms of monetary terms. People talk about climate finance. So if we're not able to come up with our policies which are costed, then it means we might be behind. So basically, that's what we've done for the low emission development strategy. And this is definitely a summary of it. And I'm sure within that summary, you can see that a lot of actions, especially that are very important for us. They are especially in the agriculture sector, which is where there's a lot of biomass. There are also some other issues on renewable energy, big hydro, and others, contributing a lot of potential in terms of achieving our low emission development strategy, which to us, we are almost halfway through, because if you look at our renewable energy policy, obviously, and the biofuels policy, they are also talking specifically about the issue of reducing emissions. So I think in terms of reducing emissions part, it seems the country is agreed that we need to move on that development pathway. I think, and also in terms of making sure that we need to have business development in this process, something that we are also possibly agreeing. And I think what is left for us is to ensure that we now move the path in terms of implementation, but also making sure that we also prioritize in terms of industrial development, so that when we talk about renewable energy, we don't want to see people flooding the Ministry of Energy with letters where they want to see our borders being opened so that imported products can continue to come into the country. That is I think that is backward in terms of thinking. Where is our innovation? Ensure that we become possibly the hub where people buy from us. That should be the thinking. So if we are opening borders, it should be, I think, something in the short term, but obviously in the long term we should see a lot of industrial development in this space. So basically that's what I can say for now. Okay. Okay, then I was emphasizing a point that we would definitely want to see in terms of our renewable energy sort of approach in the country. Would want to see it sort of maybe more focused in terms of developing our resources here, local resources, but also business development, so that we talk less in terms of opening borders, so that we continue to ship out our forex resources to buy things from outside, without us investing in terms of industrial development in the country, using the resources that we have, and that should be our thinking. So what then becomes the role of our innovation centers? That also becomes an issue. So in terms of our approach, in terms of low emission development strategy, we should see the green economy, but the green economy should be anchored on the green jobs, but the green jobs not only on the retail part of it, where people are buying solar systems and selling there around Kaguri, that type of thing. That's not what we are looking at, but we are looking also at seeing business development throughout the whole process of the value chain. So let's talk less in terms of opening borders, but let's talk more in terms of investment, the real investment here, and the real innovation, real collaborations with other countries, possibly to open up in the manufacturing plants here in the country. Those are the issues that we need to see. A lot of this collaboration. That's what we want to see in terms of achieving our low emission. So one last thing that I want to answer for that, how are we going to end this revision process? So in terms of the revision process, we are not going to do, I think, some out well research. Much of the work, definitely in terms of what we want to commit ourselves, definitely this work has already been done with the low emission development strategy, which was obviously done by the participation of all ministries, but specifically also the Minister of Energy. It was the one chairing the mitigation committee, so it was the one responsible for doing this. But we also are going to draw a lot of work from what we've already done with the policy that we've done. But more importantly, this work is going to have some contributions from some international organizations, UNEP, the World Bank, ICLE, FAO, IRENA, and many others. UNDP also coordinating the whole program, COMESA, doing that one. But what then is going to happen is to ensure that we need to select the mitigation options that we are going to choose. But it is not just going to be done like people sitting down under the tree as such, but we are going to have sector-specific consultations based on the action permanent physics we're talking about today in terms of inmobility, and I think it's something that we want to put into our low emission development strategy. Because when you put something in our revised NDC, it also shows commitment that a country wants to move in this direction, and that will also open up even for more support for those people who possibly might want to support us. So basically, I might end here and maybe wait for questions as they come. So thank you so much for listening.
Why are we talking about transportation under a renewable energy context? Account for 22% of the 11.9 megatons carbon dioxide emissions in the energy sector as of 2015 in the region. The emissions from transport are also forecasted to The emissions from the transport sector are forecasted to rise significantly as demand for vehicles and transport services increase with economic growth, particularly for passenger cars. For example, at our border post at Bedbridge, in the period of 2017 from January to August, a 40.9% increase was recorded in vehicle imports as compared to the same period in the previous year of 2016. The proposed plans in the low emission development strategy is to reduce carbon intensity of travel systems by shifting away from passenger car use to modern buses and non-motorized transport, and reduction of gasoline and diesel demand by internal combustion engines vehicles through the uptake of electric and hydrogen vehicles. Mitigation potential in low carbon transport. The transportation sector presents a great potential in terms of mitigation, where the largest shares of mitigation potential comes through a combination of fuel savings and the use of alternative and low carbon fuels and vehicles. As seen in the presentation, that fuel economy takes about 33%, while biodiesel contributes about 22%. Moving on to the Zimbabwe public transport initiatives. In the past 2 years, we've seen plans in rolling out mass public transport systems, as spearheaded through the Zimbabwe National Bus Company, ZUCO, where the company was capitalized through the state in the tune of more than 300 buses, whilst another batch of 500 buses is yet to come. And from the private sector, about 294 buses have been cleared for use in this same scheme. Then there is the rolling out of the National Transport Master Plan, which has been from 2018 up until the period of 2038. And then the introduction of the Zimbabwe Investment Development Agency, which has facilitated project integration, such as the proposed Harare Rail project, where about 48,000, a maximum capacity of 48,000 passengers have been projected in one direction in a single hour. Moving on to the benefits of embracing mass public transport systems. Transport GHG emissions reduction by 2050, which is a desirable win-win result towards local and global targets. Then there is reduction in traffic congestion and fatalities. It also brings health benefits to the community through reduction of air pollution-related illnesses and death. Public transport systems improve social connections. And lastly, commuters become more productive in public transit than in cars, where commuters can read, can write, or can even relax. There are also some challenges that comes through mass public transport implementation in the country, such as dispersal of development through suburban growth, which in turn increases capital and operating costs, which require either higher fares, greater subsidies, or both, which is all under a financing gap. The responses to these challenges include alternative service concepts, new technology and automation, more efficient service delivery, and alternative source of funding. In conclusion, I would like to echo the words of the UN Secretary General at the recent IEA Clean Energy Transition Summit, where he says we have a choice. We can go back to where we were, or we can invest in a better, more sustainable future. We can invest in fossil fuels whose markets are volatile and whose emissions lead to lethal air pollution, or we can invest in renewable energy, which is reliable, clean, and economically smart. I thank you.
Also, allow me to acknowledge you as our Master of Ceremony and acknowledge the presence of the Deputy Minister of Energy and Power Development, Honorable Magnam Giwa, the Permanent Secretary in the Ministry, Dr. Engineer Gloria Magombo, the CEO for AMH, Mr. Mafukidze, members at Sango there, all those present at Sango Conference Lodge, and those who have chosen to join this summit through virtual, which has now become our new normal. I welcome you all. The presentation from Zera perspective with regards to e-mobility is to focus on the work we are doing towards coming up with a framework for e-mobility. The presentation layout is just briefly to touch on the Zera mandate, then talk about what is electric mobility, why we should move towards e-mobility, the link between e-mobility and renewables, the benefits of e-mobility, the milestones and implementation. But just to let the viewers know is that Zera has already acquired an electric vehicle. We're just going through the process of finalizing the importation papers and payment of duty. And also to inform the viewers that Econet through the Cassava Tech have got a number of the taxis as electric vehicles, which is quite an encouraging development, which we feel as a regulator we should have actually taken more steps towards drumming up support for e-mobility and actually even coming up with the infrastructure for e-mobility. But nonetheless, it's something we're working towards. With regard to the mandate for Zera, we are mandated to regulate the whole energy sector, deriving our mandate from the Energy Regulatory Authority Act, the Electricity Act, and many other. The functions, we have got 18 functions according to the Act, but we group them into 6. Relevant today being the promotion of energy, the ensuring environmental protection. And the presentation. The reason for it to ensure that monopoly is framed, reduce subsidies in the energy sector.
Sorry, Mr. Williams. Sorry, just a breakaway that's happening. I don't know whether there's an improvement on your end that you can do, just so that we can, it's breaking away.
Okay, sorry about that. I was saying that why we regulate the sector, I was talking of issues to do with moving away from subsidies. Permanent Secretary spoke to cost-reflective tariff. That's one way of ensuring that in the tariff structure, we have done away with subsidies, which are a cost to the populace through the fiscus interventions. We also want to optimize the structure in the energy sector. It also promotes participation, private sector participation. Then our stakeholders is given, which also includes media, and we have to thank AMH for their unwavering support to the sector in terms of hosting this. We hosted another renewable energy summit. I think was it in March or February this year, and here we are with one of our key stakeholders, the media. Then, with regards to e-mobility, this is the way to go. In terms of, I heard the gentleman from, I think it's Lawrence from the Environment Ministry, talking about targets in terms of action of greenhouse emissions. E-mobility is cleaner. It's a cleaner way of it's cheaper in terms of, I will see through some of my presentation, some of my slides, that it's actually cheaper to run an electric motor vehicle because there are lesser moving parts as compared to the internal combustion vehicle. Why should we embrace e-mobility? Already I spoke of issues of it being environmentally friendly. It also reduces the fossil fuel imports. It improves efficiency in transport. Reduces greenhouse gas emissions, as I said earlier on. Nexus between electric mobility and renewable energy. It will be pointless for this conference is to do with renewable energy. It will be really pointless for us to charge electric vehicles using power generated from thermal. So the regulator, we are promoting that most of the charging stations which are going to be developed be from renewable energy. For now, we are focusing on solar. We have been engaging with most of our service station network, which are selling fossil fuel, to install solar panels on their rooftop so that they can actually then use the charging systems using solar. Wouldn't want to move away from fossil fuel and replace that with thermal gases. We are actually encouraging the use of renewable energy for motor vehicles. Advantages for using electric vehicles: it is low fuel cost. It's equivalent to about 2 liters of fossil fuel to 100 kilometers. It's cheaper to make due to less moving parts. It's environmentally friendly. They are actually quite, we always talk of the actual emissions as the only pollution we have. There's also noise pollution, which comes from the fossil-driven vehicles. There's also a competitive range, and it continues to be improved through R&D in the e-mobility. What we have done to date in terms of promoting e-mobility, like I said, indicated earlier on, that we have actually bought a demo electric vehicle, which we should be using pretty soon, and also using for our campaign for electric mobility. We are developing standards. We are also developing regulations to promote the electric mobility. We are developing electric vehicle and charging infrastructure policy and regulatory options. While we celebrate the advent of electric vehicles, there are also dangers which we need to safeguard. That's why we're developing all these standards and regulations to make sure that we use electric vehicles in a manner. The development of the charging infrastructure policy and regulatory options. There we're talking of the issues to do with adhering to international standards. We're also adopting ISO electric vehicle standards for quality control, drafting regulations to govern electric vehicles industry in the country. We're also engaging with industry players on the installation of pilot charging infrastructure. One of our government-owned companies has already expressed willingness to electric vehicle charging system. We are actually liaising with learning institutions. We have written to them to have some R&D with electric mobility. We are with the utility to establish for electric vehicle. Also coordinate uptake for renewable energy, indicated earlier on by reaching out to the service stations for them to have rooftop solar so that it can then be used for charging electric. We are also working on pharmaceutical. Those national targets. We are working on through our parent ministry to lobby with the Ministry of Finance and Economic Development to have annual duty-free targets. We want to work on this so that we can actually promote initial uptake for electric vehicles, and then facilitate investment in at least 2 vehicle assembly plants. We will be working together with the Ministry of Industry and Commerce to see if we can have this done. Then we want to set up a national committee consisting of ZETDC, Renewable Energy Association of Zimbabwe, Association of Zimbabwe, ourselves, the regulator, ZIMRA, Ministry of Industry and Commerce, Ministry of Higher Education. I had actually left out the environmental aspects. Thanks to Lauren's presentation, I realized that we left out one key player in this whole aspect. I think it's the fact that they've been moving ministries for the past 2 years. So but we definitely are going to we have full representation at policy and industry level. We are going to engage banks. We have already had some initial discussions with quite a number of banks around financing of purchase. Engage including the fleet electric buses. It's a topic we want to broach when we are next invited to the Parliamentary Energy, so that we start making the right noises in the right places for the investment of this e-mobility. The Ministry of Ministry of Environment and Climate, although I in the committee which we are working on, we are actually working together with them. Technology Center and Network under the United Nations Environment Program. We do have some roadmap outputs in the CTCN roadmap, which are given on the slide there. The development of the national electric vehicle policy is quite key. It's one area we need to work with speed so that at least we have guide we want to go. Then and deploy electric vehicles. Then implementation. And tax exemptions, local authorities in terms of licensing and parking fees for differential toll fees with Zinara, up with the unique numbers, probably having a green bed, working with the CV. For us as the regulator, standards and regulations, together with SARS, promoting, we have a very close working relationship with the Standard Association of Zimbabwe. We will be developing standards and bringing them before committees and Standard Association of Zimbabwe before they are adopted in the country. Working, as I indicated, with educational institutions, we have already contacted them with regards to research and development, and also working with industry. I think what's key is the fact that we've got huge lithium deposits. We need to see a value addition by Zimbabwe being the center for the production of lithium-based batteries, which are very useful in terms of electric mobility. So we'll be working with all concerned to try and ensure that we just don't export our lithium and then end up importing the batteries at a value-added cost. But the way to go, colleagues, is that we need to embrace e-mobility for all the benefits which I've outlined. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. We are ready to take any questions.
Mr. Mazambani, thank you very much for the presentation. I'd like you to also just take note of the questions that are coming through on the chat. Maybe you may want to answer them when at the end when we are answering questions. But I was just taking note of what you just covered. You covered e-mobility. It's the way to go. You talked about the functions, the benefits which are environmentally friendly, the issue of efficiencies. You looked at also matching renewable energy and in terms of having solar for the programs. So thank you very much for that input. Just a question that I would like you to keep in mind. We talked about efficiency, and we're still importing combustion vehicles. How are we migrating from combustion vehicles to hybrids or maybe electrical cars? And is there any policy related to that at the moment? Because people are importing cars, and we are, in terms of efficiencies, we have a big challenge. So it's a question you may want to take note of. And Mr. Zigauke, here's another question that I would like you to keep in mind. We purchased 300 vehicles, all in combustion vehicles. Why didn't we just migrate to the new technology, the new kid on the block? Maybe that's from Ministry of Transport. You can also take this. At this stage, I would like to ask my colleagues from Zimtok to come in and offer their presentation as they explain the new technology. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, honorable delegates from the Ministry of Energy and Ministry of Transport, and also from ZERA, who are actually watching from the Zoom meeting. I would like to give you a brief history of what exactly Zimtok is. We started in 2010 as a transport development private brand. We've been around for 10 years, and our aim has been to achieve what can be achieved in any world, to promote Zimbabwe as one of the biggest hubs in following technology in terms of transport. Looking at the topic, we were given the preparedness of vehicle manufacturing of EVs and hybrids. We have put up strategic plans and timelines. Fortunately, we've been doing this since 2016. We've been looking at electric vehicles and hybrids. And this year we managed to join the ZERA framework policy, which are some of the things that they have highlighted we've been actually doing. Today also marks the day World EV Day has been launched worldwide. And to tell you this, we are one of the only African countries to participate in this, which has been launched today. It's going to be held yearly on the 9th of September. And secondly, we have a demo vehicle also that we've been using for the past year. And I would like to say having an electric vehicle is the best and ideal here in Zimbabwe. Our climate is good. And looking at our problem with electricity, you won't face that much. As what Mr. Zambani said, he said we need to use renewable energy. So since we've been promoting the use of electric vehicles, we've also promoted the use of solar to charge the vehicles. So when you buy the car, we actually come to install the solar system for free for you to charge your car. So basically, you'll be driving for free. And the other thing is we are also planning by June 2021 to have trained technicians who can actually assemble, repair, and look at these vehicles. And to let you know, we have a Zimbabwean who was trained in America for the past 10 years. He's the world's best mechanic at the moment. He was trained at ASE and ACDC, which are institutions that train hybrid and electric vehicles technicians. His name is Tarai Siwera. I shall share his profile with you, I think, after the meeting. So he's going to be one of the pioneers of the technical school regarding electric and hybrid vehicles. The other thing is in preparing our vehicle manufacturing sector, we're going to look at safety, which is going to be a key thing, because as you know, lithium batteries are very dangerous. So we need to train our response teams, our firefighters, our ambulance guys to actually know how to devolt the vehicle and how to disembark a passenger in the event of an accident, which is very important. As the World EV Day happens today, it's something that they have preached that everyone who's going to be involved in the sector should be certified by the governing body regarding safety, manufacturing, and retail of the vehicles. In terms of retail, at the moment in Zimbabwe, ourselves, we've imported 25 electric cars that are on the road since 2016. And our target by March 2021 is to have 100 electric cars and 100 solar charging stations. Above all, we're also planning to build a motor city. That is, if we manage to get land from City of Harare, we want to build the first renewable energy motor city. A motor city that is going to run only on renewable energy, and all those lithium batteries also will need to find a way how to recycle them, because that's another important factor that we need to look at. With great news, I need to inform you that by end of this year, there will be a company called BYD Zimbabwe that's going to be bringing in electric buses, electric trucks. We're also going to be one of their official retailers, selling the buses, the electric trucks, the electric forklifts, and passenger vehicles. We've also been in contact with Peugeot France in terms of opening up an assembly line here in Zimbabwe, which they were very keen in because they are now moving to electric and hybrid vehicles. With that said, I would like to also inform you that Kenya at the moment will be assembling electric vehicles starting next year. Ethiopia also will be assembling electric vehicles under the Hyundai brand. So hopefully, if all goes well, if the framework policy is released soon, we'll be able to bring in Peugeot as an assembly line, and I hope the government will give us enough support as a private sector. As I can say now, the market is very ahead, in which I indicated when we had the last meeting at the framework policy. The market is very much ahead. There's been demand for these vehicles. Judging that we had an issue with fuel availability, a lot of people lost of productive time. They've also already moved to electric vehicles because of this. So we really need to try and assist the government in speeding up the framework policy as much as we can as a private sector, because it's going to benefit us as much as it's going to benefit them. I'm happy that Mr. Mafukidze said by the next time we meet, we should have tangible results. These targets we've set, we actually want to make sure that we exceed them by June 2021. In the first 6 months of 2021, we should have trained at least 150 technicians. By June 2021, also we need to have and make sure that we have 100 vehicles already on the road. In terms of, I think Mr. Zambani mentioned about the number plates. It's something that we've also been pushing. Besides the framework, we also need to work along with the framework policy, but we've also been trying to push because we've had customers bringing in vehicles. I think by end of November, we'll have about 60 of electric vehicles. Currently, we have 20 in transit from Japan and about 20 in transit from the UK. So then making a total number of 40 already that are going to be on the road. So what I can appeal with anyone in the private sector that is watching and who's with us is we need to try and help the framework policy be processed quickly and fast so that it can also benefit everyone. In terms of incentives, we have been offering personal incentives to our buyers, such as free solar packages, and then we've also launched what we call an EV card, whereby you won't need to pay for toll fees. That card will be loaded with toll fees, and then we've partnered up with an insurance broker. They're actually insuring those electric vehicles because the base of an electric vehicle is the lithium batteries. The body doesn't really matter. So whatever happens to the vehicle, you need to buy a new battery. So we've got an insurance company that has come in to say, look, we are ready and keen to be on the market. In terms of banks, we've spoken to CABS and Stanbic. We're still in the process of speaking to them to actually offer financing because the vehicles are quite expensive. And ZIMRA hasn't been quite favorable in terms of duties because the vehicle itself, before duty, is looking at about $10,000 to $12,000. And duty, they're charging around 40%, in which we really understand with how our country is at the moment. Duty is an important factor, important foreign currency that they can use. So I hope in the long run, when the framework policy is released, it'll be affordable to buy these vehicles. And lastly, I'll go back to the Motor City. It's something we really want to emphasize because we'll be one of the first in Africa, probably globally, to have a renewable energy, an industry that's going to run on renewable energy. That is assembling of vehicles, training of technicians, and the sale of vehicles through only use of solar. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Wow, Mr. Kutama, can I say this is trailblazing, and I think these guys deserve another round of applause. And from my impression, you are probably maybe 10 steps ahead of our policymakers and pushing them to their limits. And I'm sure you agree with me. We have people like him pushing. I wish all the other organizations could do the same. Push policymakers to implement their policies and establish frameworks. Thank you very much for that wonderful presentation, and look forward to, if you can share the presentation and more details online so that everyone can actually...
We do have a demo vehicle if anyone wants to look at it.
Okay, so before we leave, those who would like to... Thank you very much. At this stage, we are actually running through our program as much as we can. We have Sam. You talked about financing, and one sector that you also talked about was customs. And the next time we have a program like this, we're going to make sure that ZIMRA is here to hear the bottlenecks that come as a result of their office. Financing, we actually have Sam. Sam is online. Sam Tamuko. He's from ZB Capital, the managing director. Are we online, guys? Sam?
Thank you very much, Wilson. I'll acknowledge the presence of all the dignitaries from the Ministry of Energy and all our colleagues from the Ministry of from the renewable energy sector. My presentation, I'm basically going to be talking about the dollars and cents. I think if you've listened through to previous presenters, I think there was quite a fair amount of mention around how the financial sector can also play a role. I must confirm that the financial sector has got a very critical role in terms of funding the deployment of renewable energy. technology in the country. What I've basically done is I've basically divided the renewable energy sector into two sections. There's the retail side, which is basically your homes, and the commercial side. Commercial side, I'm basically looking at significantly bigger projects. I've also divided the financiers or investors into three sections. The first one being banks. I've also looked at pension funds and insurance companies, as well as other financiers as well. If you're looking at banks on the retail side, in terms of the funding opportunities that are there, I think they're the conventional loans. If you can go to the previous slide. Yes, thank you. They are the conventional personal loans that I think almost all banks are actually offering. There's a big debate around the suitability of the funding or the tenure and the pricing of that kind of funding that's available for the retail side of the renewable energy subsector. We also have mortgage financing. I think this one is a very interesting one because if you drive through, I think a significant number of properties in Zimbabwe are actually debt-free. I think a lot of the mortgages were basically wiped up by inflation. So a lot of houses don't actually carry any credit. So there's an opportunity there around financing of, for the retail side of the market where individuals can basically get equity release loans from their mortgage-free properties. And the funding availed can then be used for the purchase of renewable energy. We are also looking at asset finance where banks also just acquire the relevant renewable energy technology. The ownership can only be passed on to the consumer once the loan is fully paid. So that's how banks can possibly play a role towards deployment of renewable energy on the retail side. If you look at the commercial side, I think that's where a lot of the challenges are. The opportunities for banks there is around the business loans, which are basically your conventional loans. And I think most banks are looking at a tenure of between 2 and 3 years. Obviously, there's been a big debate around the issue of security because, as you might remember, the funding that is availed by banks actually belongs to depositors. And unfortunately, banks cannot offer loans that are actually unsecured, for obvious reasons. We are also looking at structured finance, where I think banks can actually tailor-make the funding that's actually available for renewable energy projects to the project cash flows as well. I think from our experience, we've noticed that the bigger projects, the payback tends to be fairly long, and the funding that needs to be available there also needs to just mimic the revenues that those projects actually produce. We are also looking at mortgage finance. We do realize that a number of some of the project promoters for commercial renewable energy projects, some of them actually have properties that are also debt-free. I mean, those ones can also be leveraged upon so that the projects can also access funding there. We are also looking at asset finance, like I indicated earlier on. This is basically funding that's actually availed, where ownership of the asset only passes on to project owner upon full amortization of the loan. If I can also then proceed to pension funds and insurance companies. Why pension fund and insurance companies? I think historically in the country, I think these guys have played a critical role in terms of financing of infrastructure projects. And we actually look at renewable energy as one sector which is also can also be regarded as infrastructure. On the retail side, unfortunately, I don't think pension funds have got the capacity and the knowledge to actually provide funding to that particular sector. They can possibly do that through banks, where banks can actually provide or float debt instruments which pension funds can subscribe to, and banks can then only lend that money to the retail side. Then on the commercial side, pension funds can also just provide equity finance. In this case, they actually become shareholders in the project. That's the most preferred funding because it's less costly and there's no burden of interest and capital repayment. There's also structured finance where again funding can be availed, and that funding would then need to be aligned to the project's cash flows. We can also look at hybrid finance, which is basically a combination of debt and equity. Again, that kind of funding structure, depending on the actual project that's being funded, tends to be more preferable because it does reduce the interest and capital repayment burden in the early years of the project. We are also looking at BOT funding structures. This largely relates to public sector projects where project promoters can possibly finance projects. They can build and operate, then transfer the project to a public utility, for instance, after an agreed period of time. Then we also look at other financiers. You can look at vendor financing that can also be availed on the retail side of the market. We're also looking at asset financing, which I highlighted earlier on. Then on the commercial side, we are also looking at ordinary equity that I already highlighted. We're also looking at mezzanine finance. This is basically debt that can potentially be converted into equity at an agreed period. Again, also very preferable because it does remove the burden for the project to actually pay interest in capital. We are also looking at BOT funding structures. Like I indicated earlier on, these ones relate largely to public sector infrastructure, renewable energy infrastructure projects. So in a nutshell, those are some of the funding and investment opportunities available for banks, pension funds, and other investors. I'll then move on to the next slide, where I'm actually going to be talking about how perhaps the government can actually stimulate renewable energy financing. I must concede or acknowledge the fact that I think the participation of financial service sector in the funding of renewable energy sector has largely been very low. And I'll talk about some of the ways that government can perhaps look at in terms of stimulating the financial service sector to play a much more active role. We are looking at incentives that can actually be made to consumers. I think we're looking at tax. I think there was earlier on a mention of issues around duty. We are also looking at net metering, and I'm glad the permanent secretary has already talked about the deployment of net meters. Well, the issue of course I think still remains an issue of concern, but I think we're actually moving in the right direction because it is an incentive at household level because most people would end up producing excess electricity. We are looking at incentives for the banks and the investors also. For the investors, if you look at pension funds, I think they've got a legal requirement to actually invest in prescribed assets. If some of the instruments that can be availed to them actually have prescribed asset status, I think that will also incentivize them to deploy more funding towards renewable energy. For the banks as well, I mean, some tax incentives can also be availed in conjunction with even the Reserve Bank. We are also looking at capacity building within the financiers and investors. I think I always give an example of if you look at the agricultural sector, I think almost every bank you walk into in Zimbabwe actually has got an agro division, which is fully manned by fully qualified agronomists and people that have actually done agriculture. I think there's still a lot that can be done in terms of giving capacity to banks for them to actually have departments that are fully occupied by people that are fully trained in renewable energy. I think this can actually be done in conjunction with our tertiary institutions. We're also thinking that in terms of what government can also do is we can also include renewable energy within the school curriculum at a very young age, so that people can also appreciate and become more knowledgeable about renewable energy. We are also looking at reduction in licensing costs. I think Dr. Magumbo has already talked about that, because I think for the larger projects, the cost of licensing can actually be a challenge. We're also looking at project development funding being made available, particularly if you're looking at the large-scale projects. It does cost a lot of money for projects to become bankable. And I'm glad, I think Secretary Magumbo has also talked about the fact that government was also working towards ensuring that funding is made available to ensure that project promoters can actually finance their projects or develop them to the stage that they become bankable. So in a nutshell, I think that's how I think the banking and other financial institutions, the opportunities that they can possibly explore within the renewable energy sector. It's still fairly new area, and there's a lot that can actually be done. But I'm glad that there's a realization that renewable energy is indeed the future. Thank you.
Remember, we had our show, the Green Show, and we talked about reference projects. The issue of risk for banks. Banks are afraid to get into these renewable energy projects. Maybe you may want to just write up something on the chat, and then we'll try and pick it up as we go. Reference projects, as we try to mitigate the risk that comes. Banks are weary. They're afraid that if we get into these projects, we might just end up losing because of the capacity that the bank has. So based on your suggestion, we should have a banking sector with a similar approach like the agro business sector of the bank, where we are looking at a renewable energy sector within the bank and expressing opportunities. At this stage, we would like to welcome Jeremiah. Jeremiah, you're online.
So thank you very much for this opportunity to talk today to you about sustainable financing. I think my presentation will be very short, and I'll be focusing more on the financing for the transport sector, since it's the theme of the summit today. And I must say that I think my job has been made easier through the presentation from Zera and through the presentation from ZB, because they actually touched on a lot of things that I was going to say. So probably I'll focus more on the readiness of the transport sector for it to be able to access and leverage sustainable financing in moving forward the sector in a greener pathway. Can I have the next slide, please? So thank you very much. As the United Nations Development Programme in Zimbabwe, we have been supporting the government of Zimbabwe through a number of programs, and we are happy that we've been part of the many development partners who have also supported the development of the renewable energy policy and also the low emissions development strategy that was presented today by the Minister of Environment. And if you look at the low emissions development strategy, roughly there are about 23 mitigation measures across all the sectors which were identified in that particular document. And as UNDP, we realized that there were several recommendations from the low emissions development strategy, which we picked up to support through one of our programs called the Global Climate Policy, which is aiming to support more than 100 countries across the globe to implement and enhance their nationally determined contributions through technical and financial support. So under that same program, we realized that there was some work that needed to be done in terms of the e-mobility framework, the energy policy, MRV systems to support the energy sector to go forward in a low greenhouse gas emissions pathway as a country. And so today I'll focus more on sustainable finance, which I will interchangeably use with the term climate finance, which is basically any form of financial service which integrates environmental, social, and governance criteria into business or investment decisions. So basically sustainable finance, it covers both the financing part of it and also the investment part of it in terms of activities which are needed to support the sustainable development goals, particularly issues to do with climate action. Next slide, please. So as you may have realized that the transport sector globally is also the second largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, and in the country, in Zimbabwe, you will see that it is a subsector of the energy sector, and the figure in terms of contribution has already been given. And you realize that it may not be possible to effectively address climate change without substantive greenhouse gas emissions reduction by the transport sector. So for us to be able to mitigate the massive potential increase in GHG emissions from this sector, our economies must dramatically shift annual spending to increase the role of low carbon transport, right? So to do this, we need a diverse funding mechanism, a diverse funding, architecture that looks at both public and private sources of finance, so that we can supply our needs in the transport sector to make sure that we green the transport sector. So to start with, is the Zimbabwe transport sector ready for climate finance or sustainable finance for us to take forward, for example, some of the recommendations that were given by the low emissions revenue strategy in terms of the recommendations? Are we ready as the transport sector to access these funds? So when it comes to readiness, I think readiness is basically the capacity of the country or of the sector to be able to plan, access, receive, report on sustainable finance, right? So for the sector to be ready, there are several building blocks, right? These building blocks are there to encourage and leverage sustainable financing in the transport sector. So as you can see on the screen, we have about 7 building blocks, which I'm going to talk more in detail, but quickly, so that we understand if the transport sector is ready, if it's not ready, which areas we really need to tackle, so that at the end of the day, we have the financing that we need to take the sector forward. So these building blocks, they basically outline a pathway, to the ground readiness for leveraging sustainable financing in the transport sector, which these building blocks can be pursued in any order as you may require, but definitely institutional arrangements would be the first step. So building on this and focusing on these building blocks, a developing country like Zimbabwe can actually strengthen its institutions, processes, and general investment criteria, right? Investment climate, so that we move forward in terms of, leveraging private sector finance in this sector. May I have the next slide, please? Next slide, please. Okay, thank you very much. So in terms of the institutional arrangements, we really need to make sure that there is a lot of coordination between several levels of government, institutions and agencies to ensure that the efforts that we're talking about today are efficient, properly coordinated, and they are in line with the national objectives. For example, we're talking about the low emissions development strategy, we're talking about the national development strategy, we're talking about the nationally determined contributions, and many other policies, strategies, and national priorities that have been put down by the country to make sure that we take the country through a low emissions development pathway. To the left there, you see some of the institutions that have kind of identified which are key to taking the transport sector towards a low carbon development pathway. So the public institutions, most of these and many others which I didn't identify, they must send a clear signal that low carbon transportation is a priority by setting concrete goals and coordination interactions among these public institutions. Some of these have been already mentioned, for example, when it comes to importation duty, when it comes to other taxes and many other incentives, which can send a very clear message to would-be investors, would-be project developers. So there's also need to provide technical support for infrastructure development in line with those national priorities I've identified. There's also need to develop a long-term inter-agency partnerships among these agencies and ministries and other specialized agencies to make sure that the implementation of the low emissions development strategy, especially focusing on the mitigation measures identified for the transport sector, are taken forward. And also there is need to establish some structure or some guideline in terms of reporting to donors and lenders in terms of requirements, because different donors and different lenders, they have different requirements in terms of reporting. So that needs to be established. Building block number 2, we need to create an enabling environment transition into a low carbon economy, it's a transition which requires behavior change. It's a transition which requires policies. It's a transition which requires funding to do so. So creating a favorable enabling environment as an overarching context for transportation investment requires a stable economy, enforceable regulations, and competent local industry. So these are some of the qualities that we need to have in our economy if we're able to attract sustainable finance for the transport sector. Also, in enabling an environment, we are looking at characteristics of both public and private sectors, from national, federal, or provincial to the local level. So also the other factors which are crucial to attracting foreign investment of almost any kind. There are issues to do with some features, including fossil fuel subsidies, high transportation engineering capacity. We can attract investment, and integrated transportation land use planning, so that we send a very clear message that the sector is well planned. There are also opportunities in the pipeline for the potential investments. We also need a very clear vision and targets as a country, so that creates a very good enabling environment. We also need to build increased investor confidence, which I'm sure you agree with me from previous presentations, that when investors are looking for opportunities, they really need to see that this particular economy, they can invest, they can get a return. Next slide, please. The third building block, we are talking about a comprehensive financing strategy. So without this building block, I think we'll face many challenges. One of them is the lack of long-term finance, for example, for infrastructure in the transport sector, to make sure that the sector is greened. So for us to be able to move forward, we need a comprehensive financing strategy. In many countries, they've adopted this concept called a green bank, or a national, climate finance facility, which mainly focus on financing project activities and government programs which direct the country towards low carbon, be it in the transport sector, agriculture, industry, commerce, and almost everywhere. So that can be adopted at the national level. The reason being that we need to blend all sorts of sources of funds, from the multilateral, the Green Climate Fund, our national budget, the private sector, the United Nations, African Development Bank, and our own local infrastructure development bank. And when you are looking at the private sector, I can see two or so types of private sector. The private sector which is interested in project development, and the private sector which is interested in financing projects in renewable energy, especially in the transport sector. So for us to be able to attract investment, we require a planned course of action, firstly to identify available sources, right, of funding. Then we can combine them into a strategically well orchestrated funding mechanism at the local level. So we then also need to leverage on the impact of donor investment. So by blending, we can use the investments, grants from donors. We can then combine them, for example, with pension funds or funding from commercial banks, to come up with a project where everybody can actually benefit, but also at the same time, we'll be moving forward with the implementation of a low emissions development strategy. Also, it is important that as a country, we develop bankable pipeline projects. So this sends a very clear message to would-be investors, right? So that they know that this project, that they already have feasibility studies, they've already been, some private players or other players, development partners, who are willing also to put something to leverage the resources so that the project can be taken forward. There could be some projects which have a viability gap, right? We would then need extra funding from other sources. It's better we develop them as, bankable pipeline projects which can be, marketed to potential investors. So there's also need to track diverse sources and opportunities of funding, so that we can have strategic acquisition of complementary financing that can maximize resources to help mobilize funding. For example, as UNDP in Zimbabwe, UNESCO, and UN Women, we are working on an SDG acceleration fund. We are looking at leveraging private sector financing for renewable energy. So that's what we are focusing on, and we're working with the Infrastructure Development Bank of Zimbabwe through the Climate Finance Facility. So fourthly, for us to be able to attract the private sector financing, it is estimated that more than 50% of the funding for climate finance may be coming from the private sector, which is a very good opportunity. And for us to be able to attract this funding from the private sector for the low carbon transport sector, we can increase these sources, and it often requires us to use some financial instruments that can mitigate the risks. We need to identify what are the risks currently in the economy, because we know that private funders, they are looking for long-term investments, but they're also very averse to risk. What do we need to do? We need to de-risk investments in renewable energy projects. How do we do that? First of all, maybe we need to create a national level climate or renewable energy investment platform where we deal with these issues in terms of de-risking. So we also know that to be able to encourage private sector investment in the transport sector, governments can utilize policies and instruments which can reduce risk, increase return, and guarantee remuneration. This is very important if we are to attract private sector investors in the transport sector. So we also need to meet the ability in terms of core financing requirements. For example, if you are getting a concessional loan from GCF, they might ask you to contribute maybe 30% of the total budget. So core financing is one very important issue. And I'm glad that because already we have the national budget, which we do almost every year, we can use those resources to leverage some of these funding mechanisms. I'll tell you what, for example, one of the Green Climate Fund projects that we're implementing through the Ministry of Agriculture, we're getting 26 million, but we have co-financing, which is slightly less than 26 million, but we are taking it, or kind of taking it from the national budget, which is a very innovative way of leveraging, multilateral funding for our own good as a country. I will not repeat these. These have been given as examples from the presentation from ZB, but just as an example, we can give a tender to a private company to develop a metro system, right? They can invest in the infrastructure and the operationalization of that. Then they can then benefit from the return on investment. Next slide, please. So the building block number 5, we are talking about assessing the core benefits of having a low carbon transport sector. So if we are able to identify the core benefits, to identify and market the core benefits of the reduced greenhouse gas emissions within the transport sector through our innovative, low carbon transport systems, for example, reduced traffic fatalities, reduced commuting time, this has been mentioned, more organized transport, and improved health due to reduced air pollution. This can appeal to many and varied stakeholders so that we can garner support towards this vision. And in terms of the awareness on socio-economic, environmental health, and other positive externalities of low carbon transport, this can help strengthen the case for investment among local and international audiences. You must be aware that in the case of climate or sustainable finance, any project has an additional burden to demonstrate that that project is cutting GHG emissions. So apart to that, we also need to, demonstrate these core benefits to our stakeholders and potential investors. But the investors, they're really interested in the return on investment. So the business case should come out very well. So the core benefits should be very clear. Next slide, please. The sixth, building block that we need to understand is needed to prepare the sector to be ready for, sustainable finance. Like I mentioned, that we have an additional burden to prove that we are doing things that we promised to do. So financing low carbon transport is often, facing a lot of, it's based on the strategies and the capabilities to properly measure, report, and verify the projects. So if we claim that we are going to, avoid so many thousands of tons of carbon dioxide, you need to have a system to be able to measure, report, and verify that. So an MRV system, an MRV framework is very important for the purposes of accessing these funds, because once you get those funds based on the potential to mitigate GHG emissions, for example, if it's GCF, you need to demonstrate that you were able to do that. So in short, this is why within the low emissions development strategy, we have actually been able to develop an MRV system for the country. So this is one of the purposes, this is one of the preconditions, this is one of the building blocks that we need to make sure that we are ready for investment in terms of sustainable financing. Next slide, please. The building block number 7 has to do with data. Again, it fits into the MRV. So in terms of collecting and managing data on transport activity, mode share, emissions rates, and fuel carbon content is essential to evaluating the investment impact. So this is very critical for us to be able to then present the business case to a potential investor or to GCF itself. We really need to have the correct and accurate data for us to be able to then present the investment impact in terms of GHG emissions, but also most importantly in terms of the return on investment. But basically, if it's sustainable finance, the major premise is that of presenting how much GHG emissions are we going to cut, and data is a major component to that. Then lastly, this also enables the accurate MRV framework in terms of reporting. Next slide, please. Just briefly, something which is cross-cutting in terms of technology. We need to actually prepare the sector to be able to do transport modeling, to be able to gather the data that is required, for example, traffic counting. Also need technologies to push efficient vehicles and to be able to retrofit, for example, changing diesel buses to make them electric buses. So those are some of the technologies that we need to have. E-ticketing system, we've seen that already. Charging systems for electric vehicles, also development of bus rapid transit systems, and also we have seen some lessons from other countries in terms of hydrogen trains. So I will stop here because a lot of stuff has been said. So I just wanted to talk a bit on the readiness of the transport sector and what building blocks are we looking at to make sure that the transport sector is ready for sustainable financing. Thank you very much.
It was seamless, very clear in terms of financing the strategies that we need to take through. I noted you took about 7 of those, and you mentioned the issue of green banks. Do you think we're ready for a green bank in Zimbabwe? Jeremiah?
Thanks, Wilson. There are so many preconditions for us to have the green bank, and the concept is similar to the concept that is being used by the Infrastructure Development Bank of Zimbabwe, which comes as a climate finance facility. We are learning from the Development Bank of South Africa. They developed their own green bank, which is servicing Lesotho, South Africa, Namibia, and I can't remember the other country. But yes, I think at the moment we have some of the preconditions that we need to start to work on a green bank. But of course, there are key issues that we need to address. Firstly, issues to do with the perceived risk of the country, right? Then we also need to address issues to do with the availability of long-term capital locally. Then thirdly, I think this has been mentioned in terms of capacity or understanding of the issues and risks associated with renewable energy among the financiers, especially the banks. A lot of them, they need to come on board. We need to have a national climate or renewable energy investment platform where we de-risk these issues, where we develop a lot of pipeline projects, right, which can be financed. Some of the very key financing instruments which can be used in the green bank are already identified in the national renewable energy policy. For example, viability gap funding. Some of the community projects could be actually funded from that. And I think there's a lot that we need to do. For example, the Zimbabwe Stock Exchange, the private investors like banks, private investors like the pension funds. I think we need to structure a number of tools so that we can put together resources and we can actually stand good chances to access initial capital as loans or concessional loans or reimbursable grants or forgivable grants from organizations like the Green Climate Fund, African Development Bank. Thank you. Over to you.
Thanks a lot, Jeremiah, for that marathon submission and explaining these very critical issues. You're my friend, so I'm going to join you in the jog. I don't know, after this program, we need to take a marathon because I'm seeing how efficient you are. Jeremiah, thanks a lot on that one. At this stage, we agreed we're going to take a late lunch. and we are racing to get to 2 o'clock so that we can actually dismiss, and I hope the remaining submissions will be within the time that we're looking at.